My name is Ashley Burch, and I'm a voice actor. Specifically, I'm the voice of Eloy in Horizon Zero Dawn. Of all the things that I do, this is a cheating answer, I guess, because I enjoy voice acting and writing equally. They sort of tickle different parts of my brain. Voice acting is much more emotional and visceral, and writing is much more analytical. Feels like problem solving, sort of like you're solving a puzzle. So they sort of feed different parts of my creativity. So it's hard to choose between them. But of the things that I do, those are my favorites, my focus. So my path into voice acting for games was sort of circuitous, as most people's probably is. It's sort of, people come in from all different directions, but I've played games since I was a kid, and I realized that one could be a voice actor at all because I was playing Metal Gear Solid, which, if you've played it, is very cinematic, and the way they introduce every character is they give the character's name, and then there's a name underneath it, and at the time, I didn't understand, because it said Solid Snake, and then David Hayter, and I was like, who's David Hayter? And I looked it up, and realized, oh, this is the voice act, he does this for a living, he gives Solid Snake his voice, and it was the first time it sort of clicked for me that that was a career that you could have. So I knew I wanted to do that, but the way that I went about it was sort of less direct than you might think. I have a web series with my brother called Hey Ash, What You Playin', which is sort of like sketch comedy about video games, sort of surreal and weird. And we were sort of doing it as a practice. It wasn't something that we intended or thought would be anything significant or make our careers, but it kind of did. So it became popular enough that my brother and I started getting attention, and then I started booking voice acting roles, and then slowly sort of built up a career. But without Hey Ash, I probably would not have gotten any sort of recognition, I guess, or been on anyone's radar, I guess. So the process for voice acting for games can vary. There are different, not styles, but different requirements. So there's performance capture, which means that you're in the suit with the funny balls on it, and you're in what's called a volume, and you're acting as if you're in a theater in the round. So it's your facial performance and your physical performance is being captured by multiple cameras around the volume, but you're having to emote and project in such a way that it's as if you're doing a small theater setting, just because you need your facial expressions to show up, and if you're being too subtle, then it's hard for animators to be able to do anything with that when they get the final footage. So there's that, which is more, I guess, closer to what you might think of an on-camera set being like, where you have to memorize your lines and you're working with other actors directly. Generally, at least in my experience, motion capture is only used for cutscenes in games, but your vocal performance is captured on the day in that moment. But then separately, and then for some games you never do performance capture, but also separately you have to do some booth time. So that's kind of, when people think about video game voice acting, that's probably more what they think of, which is you're in a booth in isolation, and you have a director and a sound engineer, and maybe a dev or two, either in person or on Skype with you, and the script in front of you, and sometimes you're cold reading, which means you've never seen the script before, and you're reading the line for the first time and performing it at the same time. Sometimes you do get a script beforehand, but very rarely does that happen with video games. Sometimes you may not even know what character you're playing. Sometimes you may not know what game you're in. So the skills that you sort of need to have are the ability to come in, again, be able to cold read, so to be able to read something and perform it in the same moment, and also to be able to sort of formulate a character fairly quickly. There have been some games where I've had to come in and play 3 different characters, and sort of on the spot you have to find ways to differentiate your voice and your attitude to make them feel distinct from one another, and all of that sort of stuff. Not that there's a strictly improvisational quality to it, but that sort of flexibility is necessary because you don't get a lot of prep time often. I think the thing that's so interesting and sort of inspiring about Eloy is that, so she is the sole protagonist of an open world game, which is not something that you see often. Oftentimes when you're playing a game, you get to choose genders. You can either be the male version of the protagonist or the female, or if you have a single option, it's usually just a male protagonist. So it's pretty rare that there's a game where you get one option and it's a lady, and it happened to be me in this particular instance. So that alone was both extremely exciting and also a little harrowing, because I wanted to make sure I did a good job. But I think the beautiful thing about Eloy is that she, and we were very conscious of this, especially when we were finding the voice and we were creating the character, to not make her what I kind of call a capital S strong female character. So the idea that there are many female characters in all types of media that sort of don't really have a personality. They're kind of just badass, and they are really good at fighting, and they're kind of perfect. They don't really do anything wrong, and they're also completely joyless and humorless. So I don't think any of us really wanted Eloy to be that. And so the beautiful thing about Eloy is that she's so multifaceted, where she has the badass quality to her. She's very, very tough, very capable fighter, but she's also deeply compassionate, and she's curious, and she can be kind of sarcastic, and there's just a lot of things to play with her. And I think the narrative of Horizon lends itself so much to learning about Eloy and coming to care for her, because it's driven so much by her desire to know who she is and to feel like she has a place in the world, which I think is sort of a vulnerable journey and not something you get to often see. And so she just feels, I think, very human and real, which I think is also a hard thing to accomplish when you have, Eloy is a pretty determined character, but there's still some flexibility in terms of how the player wants to direct her. Is she more aggressive? Is she more kind or more analytical? And to have her have a very specific storyline while also having flexibility within that storyline to make the player feel like, this is my Eloy, it's a hard balance to strike. So I think she's just such an interesting, complex character, and there's so much to play there. The interesting thing about playing an open world protagonist is that you know that the player is going to have some say in the way that this character conducts themselves in the world. And you sort of have to make room for all of those possibilities. We have branching dialogue trees in Horizon, and there are certain flashpoints where you can choose what manner of Eloy you want to be in that moment. It's either analytical, compassionate, or aggressive. And I think the great thing about Eloy is that all of those things exist within her, and I think they're all congruent with her character. She has lots of reasons to feel angry, and she's also been sort of taught and brought up in a way to be compassionate. And also she's incredibly intelligent and curious, so her analytical mind is always on. So even if you decide to play the game 100% aggressive, I still think that there's enough in her character and there's enough context there that you can validate those choices. And for me, I felt like I really understood Eloy and where she was coming from, and I could conceive of her having any of those reactions in a particular moment based on, the context of what was going on, because she was such a rich character, and because she had such a developed backstory, that even though, there might be a moment where you could either kill someone or save them, that, I can see a potentially slightly more dark side Eloy path, as well as a more compassionate one, just based on the things that she had gone through. I had seen little bits and pieces. Like the first completed gameplay footage I had seen was for an E3 trailer that we recorded early on. And that was when I was like, oh my god, this game is beautiful and huge, and it sort of struck me, the scope of the game. But I don't think past that I had really started to see finished product until much deeper into the process. And I hadn't seen, I'd seen some kind of in progress, very, very raw, not footage, but animation for certain cutscenes and stuff like that. But it was relatively later on that I started seeing a lot of the environments and even some of the people that I was speaking to. And so it was a lot of creating stuff in my mind for some of which is common in games. You don't usually see much of the finished product until maybe literally the product comes out. The most challenging aspect, obviously being a video game voice actor, is incredibly fun. It's an awesome gig to have. I mean, it can be challenging, I think, in that there's a lot of different, which I think is the same sort of thing with any job, but there's lots of different companies and types of projects that you might work on or people you might work for. And, you know, sometimes it's less of a collaborative effort, and sometimes it can feel more like highly directed, which those sessions can be fine, but they're not as fulfilling as being in a collaborative creative process. Like I had the great fortune on Horizon of really feeling like a collaborator with the developers and my director, and to feel like, you know, I really had a stake in Eloy and a say in who she was going to become. And there are some projects where that's not as much the case. And like any, you know, acting job, it can be sort of stressful or inconsistent, and there's also, you know, some of the elements of it can be very stressful physically. There, you know, especially video games, for the most part, there's always, unless you're playing like an NPC that doesn't see combat, you're usually having to scream or make pain efforts or attack efforts for some length of time. And especially if you're new, you might not understand how to take care of yourself, and you might overwork yourself. So that's something I had to kind of learn, was to know when to, you know, sort of ask for breaks, or say, like, I think I may only be able to, you know, do one scream today, you know, my voice isn't in great, you know, whatever it is. So there's a lot of like sort of negotiating and self-advocating that you have to sort of maybe start to learn, especially earlier on in your career. I've had the great fortune of working mostly with really wonderful people, but I think that sometimes, you know, I've known other people that haven't been as lucky. So it's also hard when you're an actor, because you, especially when you're starting, you're so grateful for any job that you get that sometimes you can forget to, you know, also treat yourself as a human being in the gig, you know. And I also will say that I think it's much better in voice acting than it is in something like an on-camera gig. But especially with like protecting yourself physically, that's something that you have to be really mindful of. Yeah, if I was to speak to someone who is interested in voice acting and didn't quite know how to approach it, primarily the most important thing is to be a good actor. Really, I mean, you know, we talk about, or people think about voice acting being able to make a lot of different funny voices, or having a really great handle on different accents. And while that's all super useful, it doesn't really matter unless you have trained in the craft of acting. Also, something that I didn't know when I was starting out, but a friend who was sort of mentoring me told me, was that you often get booked on your natural voice anyway. So there are some people that are like the Swiss Army voice actors that can come in and do like 70 different voices that all sound different. But many of us will just get booked on our natural voices. So the thing that's really carrying you is your acting ability. So studying the craft and making sure that you're keeping up on that is the most important thing, I think. And then as far as breaking in, it's sort of the answer no one likes to hear, is that there's no set way. But I think developing your craft and making sure that you are staying on top of your skill set and developing your skill set is important. So when opportunities do show up, you can meet them with your best self. You know, I also know people that, you know, will take classes, and they've gotten agents that way, or maybe booked some gigs, because often people, you know, agents will conduct voice acting classes, or video game directors who will cast games will sometimes do it. So that's a good way of meeting people that are in the industry. But yeah, really, I mean, focusing on your acting, and then knowing that there are certain skills that are necessary, like cold reading. You can practice that or take classes for that kind of thing, and play games, honestly, so you kind of know what is required of you. Yeah, I think having the freedom to collaborate with developers on the literal lines of dialogue can be really great. I did it less when I was earlier in my career, just because I was sort of nervous about ruffling feathers. But I think often people are open to it, and it's also just sort of nice, because I found that even adding small things like sighs of exasperation or just a single word to get you into the line is really helpful. So I found that if I'm amending something in a way that I know will help me get more into the emotion of the line, then it's usually received well. And then also, you know, especially in some comedy games that I'm in, I've worked with people that let me kind of riff and go off, and that can just be really fun. And then you sort of can find things where maybe I say something that sparks something in some, you know, in the writer, and then they make a funnier version of it, and then, you know. So that kind of play I really love. And some people are more specific, which is also fine. But I think if there's room for that kind of play, that can be, you can just sort of discover things that you wouldn't have if you just stayed with the script.